Before this episode of Mental Music, please keep the following in mind. If you are susceptible to negative responses or triggered by discussions of depression, self-harm and suicide, this is a warning. Please take care of yourself and your own mental well-being, and if needed, reach out to someone to talk. You are not alone. Welcome back to Mental Music. I, of course, am your host as always, Max Thomas, and welcome to episode 6. Today, it's just me actually. I don't have a guest this time, but I thought that it would be a good thing. I didn't want to have a guest for episode 6, but I instead wanted to kind of have a monologue episode to just talk about what my kind of experiences have been over the past 4 or 5 years. Why I've wanted to do mental music in the first place, how it came about, and kind of what I've started to learn over this process, even though I've only recorded 5 episodes with other people. But I thought it would be good to kind of bounce some of my thoughts back at you listeners, and if it's of any use, of any consequence, this is what my experience has been with it too, and hopefully resonates with some of you. So I suppose, where should I start? It's difficult to always find a starting place, but I suppose I'll start with why I wanted to do mental music in the first place. 4th year conservatoire saxophonist. I study at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, and I'm in my final year. And this kind of whole process with starting this project as such, but also just as a podcast anyways, it goes back to things that I was originally thinking of back in my first year. I originally had an idea to create a space for musicians about musicians' mental health, particularly at a conservatoire level in that kind of workspace, but I didn't really know how to do that. I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the reach or the influence, but I just knew that it needed something like that. I think my first rendition of the idea was to have kind of almost just like a safe space, so book out a room and just talk to people about their own experiences, and maybe have 1 or 2 people maybe get some like official qualifications in just in not therapy, but just like in being almost a counselling type person of how to do that professionally, but not to any degree of having like a whole professional mindset, because I've always believed that the best way to go about this is realistically. With people who have been through things and are simply helping out by saying, look, this is a really crappy thing. This is how I dealt with it. And that just came about a lot through my own experiences, which I will get onto, just because during my whole journey of this, and particularly through my degree, a lot of advice that I have been given or been turned to has been GPs and general help points, which undoubtedly have been useful. I would never say that my GPs haven't been useful for the most part. Like it's always a really good idea to go to local health professionals to help with these things. But as musicians, we need it a bit more specifically, because as creatives, our work-life balance is thoroughly different, and having that specialist view on things, it helps like 300-fold. So yes, while it was useful, it wasn't ideal, and having problems with your mental health for me whilst studying at a British conservatoire, it almost made me feel like I was being a bit demonized by the system, which I'll get back to, but it felt like it didn't really fit with the mold, and it could be easy to get left behind. If you listen to episode 5 last time when I was talking with Max Garrard, it's something I spoke to him about, of just feeling left behind, and not feeling that you could catch up. So I did create this space. When it comes around to it with major projects, you can do anything as long as it's related to music. And so this kind of felt like a bit of a natural direction to go in. I don't think I ever intended it to be exactly how it is at the moment, but I kind of like that it's turned out this way. And that I have listeners is fantastic. And I mean, I'll take a moment to say thank you to everyone who has been listening to so far. To me rambling for 30 to 40 minutes with someone else at a time, it's a real privilege to even think that people will listen to it. And if it's helping some people by just talking about this truth, then that means a lot. And it just means that I'm bringing more people together, more people's thoughts together, and that's a wonderful thing. So on that note, I think it'd be good to tell you about my experience of things and where I've been mentally and how I've dealt with that. And it is a good story in the long way round, but it's not been without its trials and tribulations. So I suppose start from the beginning. I suppose not as far back as I have with some other folks, but a lot of my mental health difficulties started to begin around the latter years of my secondary school time. I've been very fortunate. I mean, I've worked hard for some bits, but I've been very fortunate in the opportunities that I've been able to have. But it got to about sixth form, and one of the not so good parts was that my school had quite a competitive nature to it, striving for the best grades out of the best people and putting people on plinths and giving first prizes to like everything. There was a lot of competition, and back in that time I wasn't someone who would publicly speak as I do now. I was very shy, just naturally. I hadn't come out of my shell yet. And that, I think, mixed with like a fair bit of teenage male masculinity, very toxic. I think it all really fed into a kind of pressure that was put on me to be someone that I wasn't. Though thinking on it, toxic masculinity isn't really the best word for it. I think Robert Webb put it really well. I think because he did some interviews after he released a book. If you don't know who Robert Webb is, think of Mitchell and Webb, Peep Show, that Robert Webb. But this was back in 2018, I think. And he, I think, rightfully said that toxic masculinity makes the assumption that there is anything really inherently good about masculinity and that there's a good and toxic, so good and bad side to it, which I don't actually think is the case. And I think he is right. It suggests that there is a good side to it and a bad side, but actually I think it just does vastly majoritively all harm. But that's besides the point. I felt very pressured to do stuff that I wasn't, I think, meant to do. And around that time I was maybe 16, 17. There's a lot of pressure around sixth form. I was being pushed really to do scientific degrees, and British students will know this about UCAS, so applying to universities and having to really look at it really, really early on. And that got to me. I was meant to, apparently, go study zoology. That was what I pretended to myself that I thought I should go off and do. But the main thing, it doesn't matter what subject it was, I was being pressured away from music, which was a humongous part of my life. And the more that I was being pressured away from music, but then still doing it and having this massive workload through doing a lot of extracurricular activities, it started to build up. And I had my first experiences around that time of panic attacks, where I would have like a written exam and I wouldn't know what to do and I would freeze. But then I wouldn't freeze and I'd do everything, and then the result would come back and it would be far, far lower than I expected. And it's because I wasn't learning, and I wasn't learning the right way, and I wasn't interested in the right way. So of course it wasn't going in, but that still caused me to panic because I was under this self-belief of not wanting to do the right thing. So yeah, that first led to my first panic attacks, really. That led up into A2 exams. back when there was a difference, when there was AS and A2s and not just A levels as a whole. But it led to just a big breakdown that I had in my final year, where I think it was in the Easter holidays, and I just completely wept and came to my dad at the time and said, I can't do it. I need to go and do music. Like, this is too much. And he said, yeah, that's okay. We can do that. And so I decided to take a gap year. And previously to that, this stuff had been building up. And around that time, I really did wonder what was wrong. It was certainly affecting my school life and just my own well-being, really. So I had started counselling around that time, and that was around the first time that I had a major incident of self-harm. And so I started counselling out around that time, and after the end of my secondary school time, I took a year out. I decided, I'm going to need to reapply and apply to conservatoires. I guess at the time I didn't really know much of what I was doing because I hadn't really prepared for that kind of life. But I needed to take a gap year and need to take some time out for myself. And then also in that, I needed to get some help for myself mentally. So the big thing I did in that time was I did 6 months of cognitive behavioural therapy. And that was a huge thing. It was a huge ordeal. Broke down a lot of stuff that I was dealing with, particularly around anxiety and social anxiety, and really gave me a kind of specific focus for how to deal with that, both internally in myself, but also so I could function in the real world, and gave me a stepping stone for that. So that's, I guess, the first chapter of it. I guess the second chapter of my story comes when I auditioned for Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, and I got in here, and I accepted the offer and I started. And I think probably the first month or two was fine. And then I declined. And I think that showed a lot in kind of reclusiveness that I started experiencing. And, it was just adding up a lot. So I turned to resources that I could find, and I found counselling service that was through Birmingham City University, which is much more of a general approach to counselling. And my counsellor for several years, she was very understanding, but still didn't know too much about conservatoire life, being musician, but she was still extremely helpful. But that only did so much, and I got to the point where I got myself referred to GP, and I started on medication, and that was back in November of 2017. I had a big kind of chip on my shoulder, I suppose, because I'd done this massive amount of work in that year off that I thought, I don't need medication, this is fine, I don't need to go on medication. It's just, no, that's a completely different thing. But it just got to a point very quickly where I knew that I wasn't coping and I needed some point of balance so that I could then steady myself and keep myself up. And that's what medication is. It's not to some it may be a consistent that it needs for a long time. But for a lot of people, it's a stepping stone. It's a platform to be able to say, okay, this is allowing me to have a bit of a balance, and then I can work from here. And it gives me a good platform to look underneath and be like, oh, that's what's wrong. I can deal with that. And that's what I originally kind of first went into having medication as. And that was November of 2017. And that helped combat more of there was some anxiety that I still had that was helping me to deal with, but it was a lot more of a low mood thing. And that's what they originally, not entirely diagnosed it as at the time, but it was more what they thought of it as, less of a depression per se, but quite a lot of low mood. I got a decent doctor in the end, and someone who was much more understanding. Mainly, I had a bit of a weird experience with GPs because I think some GPs expect you to know protocol of how to go about things with mental health. And the first person I saw, I won't mention the doctor's name, But she was very judgy of me in this really dishevelled, quite shaky, nervous state that I was in, and just giving me a hard time about not knowing where to be and not knowing what appointments to book. And like, I wasn't in the best place, and she was just expecting a lot of me. So I thought, nope, I am not seeing her again. I will get Ubers to like the medical practice that is much too far away, but I don't care because I know I'll see much nicer people. But I digress. So I started first on citalopram. That's the name of the medication I was first on. And it was on a relatively low dosage. And that kind of showed because it worked for a little bit. But after a few months, I'd say about 2 or 3 months, I was upped dosage. I think it was doubled or tripled. I can't quite recall now. But it seemed to help. And alongside that, I also went to see some other people to help. So also checking in with my GP, but also going to this place here in Birmingham called Pause. And Pause is kind of a check-in place where you can walk in and you can talk to trained counsellor people and they can listen to you. And it's a service that's directly aimed for young people up to the age of 25. And they started to really help me just because I could just go to them and talk about things. And then they could help by referring me on to further people if I needed, or if it was just to talk to them about things and then come back to them a couple of weeks later and just let them know, because they keep things on file. They were a hugely useful service, and I think they really saved me a couple of corners because, yeah, there were some really difficult moments then. But yeah, so that's kind of where that was going, and for a time it was a little bit up, and I still wasn't really that happy. I was still quite scared, I suppose. But I kept going, and I was keeping okay with university work. Medication was doing enough, I thought at the time. But then I'd say later on into that year, I got into like my first major adult relationship, which was a big thing for me, and I thought I was doing great with that. But honestly, it was masking a lot of things, and so it really distracted me from my problems. And I was barely practicing. I was focusing a lot of energy into that relationship. And I wouldn't want to go too much into detail of it, but I really kind of deteriorated over that time. We get through into summer of 2018, and first year had gone okay. And while it wasn't the best, it certainly wasn't the worst, and with everything that I had been dealing with, I was relatively proud of myself. But I think with a lot of these things, situational dominoes can hit harder than tsunamis. And I was at home. It was just for a day where there was nobody else in the house. And yeah, I was alone. My girlfriend at the time was at her family home. My parents were both out. My sister wasn't there. And I got a couple of bits of bad news and things that had been miscommunicated. And I was stupid enough to have stopped taking my meds at the time. A bit of lack of foresight. But it got to a point of just absolute lack of hope, void of it. And that was the first and only time that I ever considered taking my own life. And I want to preface this with that I didn't injure myself. But what I did do was I was in the kitchen, and for 50 minutes I was staring down a knife that I held at my chest. And that was very heavy. And I look back on it now with a mix of emotions. I think the first one is just, in a way, a sense of pride. And that might surprise you. It certainly surprises me on a day-to-day basis when I do think about it still. But pride that I was able to stand there for so long, just so close to actually doing it, and being so sad, and being so down and just feeling worthless, and then not doing anything, and just through sheer bloody will not doing anything. I think there's a real ode to the dramatic when people think about attempts on people who take attempts on their own life, who try to do that, kind of pigeonholing people into, oh, they were just doing it for attention. It's similar to self-harm, and in a base essence, I think there's a little bit of truth to that, because certainly with self-harm, which is a cry for help, but it's also a release. Suicide is a slightly similar thing, but not in the same way, not at all. For me, it came out in that I did get to that point, I stopped myself, I walked away, and then my way of crying out for help was, I'd answered my mum on the phone, but prior to that I wrote a whole 2-page letter, which I left open on the front door, and then lay on my bed for 5 hours. Because if I hadn't done that, nobody would have known, and then if nobody had known, then it would have gone unchecked, and then I don't know, I might have done it again, but then not have stopped myself. Who knows? But the point was that was quite a traumatic time, and that kind of set a lot of wheels in motion of, right, let's actually get this sorted, because it wasn't just a one and done thing. We need to take it seriously. So we did, and I went to see some psychiatrists to help, and some other GPs, and I got evaluated, and my diagnosis, the latest, most recent, fresh off the press, that I was diagnosed with mixed anxiety with depression. And from that, I got prescribed with my new medication, sertraline, the wonder that is sertraline. And so that was going into second year. And from that, I also decided that yes, I needed to be on medication, but I couldn't just sit back like I had previously done and just be amble about the help that I got. I needed to get more therapeutic help. So it was around the start of my second year, that first term, I did like a term's worth of cognitive behavioural therapy again. And it helped 2 degrees, certainly. It opened me up a lot again. I think one of the stereotypes, which is kind of true about therapy, is that some of them, when you really need it, opens you up, and it opens those wounds up, but only so that they can be stitched up and healed properly. And that's what that second bout really did, which was, it set me up. And there were a lot of tears, but it did help massively in that chapter. But through that, I also, again, was sitting on some laurels again, and I got very isolated. I was still not practicing a lot, and my academic work was going fine, but practically I was just behind, and I wasn't putting any time into myself, becoming very isolated. And again, I was still in this relationship at the time, so there was a lot of energies there, but I was shut off and isolated and depressed. Medication that I was on, it got upped again, and that did a lot. I don't know how to describe having a lack of emotional range and then that being tightened even further, but that upping of it really did that, and that kind of brought it to a head where around the end of 2018, start of 2019, I caused a lot of ruptures in that relationship that I was in, and I self-sabotaged it, and part of it was through a lot of lack of trust, and part of it also came from what I now understand to be depersonalization or derealization, which for me was basically me feeling like I was literally out of my skin, and I wasn't really that conscious of some stuff that I did. but it came from a deeper place, and that ended. And from that then brought a lot of a spiral. It brought a lot of time back to myself, and I did a lot more practice. I still am very proud of how I ended that second year, because there was a lot that I went through. But it brought me back up to a level where I was putting time into some of my friendships, and I was putting much more time into my practice, my art. But I took that breakup very badly, and for at least those first 6 months, it was a real spiral downwards again. That was when I had the second incident of self-harm, and the last. I've not done it since, but it meant that I started seeing pores more often. I had a very good friend who dragged me down there a couple of times to talk about shit with them. They were absolute saints during that time. And then it got to summer of that year, summer of 2019, which feels like so long ago now. But it was nearly 2 years ago. And I'd sorted out a place renting wise where I had a tiny studio flat to myself. I was nervous, but I was doing a lot of work, so I was keeping myself busy. And I had my own place, and it got to a point where I got confident, and rightly so, where I thought, I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you this nice story. So I had escaped from Birmingham for about a week because my family were going to Wales for a week. No, it wasn't a week, it was 2 weeks. They were going to Wales for 2 weeks. And I said, I'll tag along for a week. Why not? It'll be good to escape. I was doing a lot of part-time work at the time. And I got away, and it was just bliss. We were in this small house, like the tiny cottage that was on the same land as a massive farm cottage. And on the field next to us, we had this horse that lived in this field, and it was pure white horse. Think Shadowfax from the Lord of the Rings films, like that kind of white horse. We nicknamed it Shadowfax. We didn't find out its real name, but beautiful. And I spent a week there, and it was just it was such calm that place ensued, that I got back to Birmingham after that week, and I decided, right, I've got 2.5 weeks before I have more shifts again. I know what may happen if I come off the medication. I feel like it's doing much more harm than it is helping anymore. And I want to really just work on myself as best I can without any medical intervention. So I came off medication. And it really helped. I don't know. The best I can equate it to is getting given your right eye back. You don't miss depth perception until you haven't had it for a while. And, it really helped. Really, really helped. And so from then, what work have I done since? It culminates basically in a lot of further visits that I went to pause with, and reaching out to more of my friends who I shied away from over those couple of years, which really helped. I put myself forward for even more CBT, so I did a third set of it, which was... that was in the 2 or 3 months before the first lockdown, which is kind of ironic because I left that bit of therapy thinking, great, now I can put this stuff into the real world. I can put this stuff into practice. And then 2 weeks later, we went into national lockdown, and I thought, shit. But it still has been entirely relevant. And it was around that time that pandemic was hitting, and I was getting to the best place that I had been, and still am. I still am in a fantastic place because of all this work that I've put in. But I thought, okay, now I've got this steady pace. How can I help other people? And it was around the time where as third years you're thinking about your fourth year major project. And I thought, let's do something about mental health. And so that's where I am now. Much, much happier than I ever have been. But it's taken work. But the help is all out there. And I think this whole process has been a real journey of not learning new things, but solidifying things that I certainly already believed. But I think just through the process of hearing other people's stories, it just helps you to validate things that you've already been through, and that is always helpful. And I literally made a few notes about things I've learned so far from the episodes. I think episode 1 with Abby was a big one, just because it was the first thing of doing this, but her and I spoke about doing something for people's mental health like at least a year and a half ago. But the main thing I've learned from that, and I hope these are relatable, but the main thing I learned from Abby is that so many of our experiences are shared, that it does just sometimes take one or two people to talk about it and bring it out in the open for people to be able to point to that and say, hey, that kind of happened to me. And it's okay, because things can be done to help that. I think episode 2 with Layla, that really highlighted to me how there needs to be discussions on all areas of mental health so that people feel more comfortable to talk about them. Particularly, I think that was particularly highlighted just from talking to Layla about her experiences with eating disorder related things, and just how, similarly to discussions that I've later had on with other people, including Max Garrard, there's areas to mental health, I think, these days that are more and less of a taboo, but the taboo is still there and it still needs conversation. Otherwise, we're just going to fall slack. And eating disorders have become a bit of a topic that's much more talked about, but I don't know, is still not given the gravitas I think it really needs, particularly for young women. And it just needs more people talking about them, and loads of other discussions in all sorts of areas are needed. I think episode 3 and 4 were interesting because I loved bringing other people's stories about their mental health to the table, but I also wanted to really highlight what other people are doing from the inside of our little corner of the creative arts and doing to help other people. And Sigi was wonderful to talk to, just because the more spaces that we do create to champion ourselves and people like ourselves, the healthier the music industry and music education is going to be. As much as we can put good faith into institutions, it takes work from student unions, and it takes work from student-led groups and student-led forums and ideas inspired by students, because we are the ones on the front lines dealing with things. We are the ones who are going along to these seminars and reaping the rewards from those, if there are any. If there are not, it's on us to speak up about it. I'm done just being silent on some things because other people don't speak up. Someone needs to. And that goes for any problems, but also just promoting what we do. Will is also a fantastic example of, promoting what people are doing to just help in terms of mental health in general, not just for us as musicians, but for non-musicians, and bringing that from a musical background. It's a beautiful thing. If we can help ourselves as creatives, we can really learn to listen and use our skills to help others outside of our circle. And in turn, people outside of our circle will then learn more about us as musicians and as artists, and then be able to help us more accurately. And then in society won't be deemed as, fancy pants people who are very entitled. We're just people as well. And I've talked about it a bit more today, than I thought I would, but episode 5 was a big one too. Talking to Max Goward was a real eye-opener for me, and it just really highlighted what I've known for a while, which is that we, again, similar to Layla's episode, we still have a lot of work to do, even in erasing the taboos of more well-known struggles. And it takes just knowing about the resources that we do have already. And if you know about resources, tell about other people about them, and then they'll tell someone else. And it's likely that they'll need it, and that can help. And I think there's a lot that's being done for performance anxiety, but there's still a lot to go. And I hope that, some people reach out to people in performance coach like circles for that type of help. But I think I'll end it there today. I hope you found some of this informative. I hope you learnt a bit from what I've spoken about and my kind of story. And I hope it resonates with someone out there. This has been an absolute pleasure to do as a project and just as a podcast. And I want to continue to do it. I absolutely do, where time permits. So yeah, as always, I've been Max Thomas. This has been Mental Music. Please do follow Mental Music on all of the socials. So follow us on Facebook and Instagram. This is streaming on, of course, YouTube and Spotify, but also SoundCloud and Podbean. So feel free to listen to us on there and download the episodes on there. That's greatly appreciated. Share these things if you like. But, of course, stay tuned. And, as always, take care of yourselves. Love you very much. And until the next time. Bye.